Hello everybody, Thersites here. One of the most notorious consoles in gaming history, the Sega 32X was the mushroom-shaped add-on for the Sega Genesis, which supposedly enabled the aging console to achieve next-gen power and arcade-perfect ports for a fraction of the cost of a full 5th-generation system. Despite aggressive ads touting a killer launch lineup and hinting that the 32X will have sex with your Genesis to reward it for all the years of steady service it had provided up until late 1994, the 32X was an undersupported commercial failure, and it dealt permanent damage to Sega's reputation. Tonight, I discuss and rate all 40 games which were commercially released for the 32X worldwide. Unlike most normal people, I'm not normal. Much of that I owe to the fact that I owned and spent hours playing both 32X and Sega CD as a kid. As a lifelong Sega fan, I have learned what disappointment feels like the hard way. I got the 32X for Christmas in 1994 when I was 8 years old, and I have never been more excited for any other game system, or even gift in general, than I was when I unopened, hooked up, and began playing my 32X on the night of Christmas Eve. While I have never had either the resources or the inclination to be a systematic collector of games, I own a good number of the games featured here, and I played the remainder via the Kega Fusion emulator. Why play, discuss, and rate all 40 games for the 32X, you might ask? A good question. Who the fuck gives a shit? Well, if you're still listening, you must give a shit. Welcome to the WTFGAS podcast. This is the place where we discuss things that no one really gives a fuck about because they're not that important. Unlike my other channels where we talk about history or politics or things that are relevant to the world as a whole, here we talk about things that are more fun, video games, bad movies, whatever it might be. This indeed is the pilot of what could be something great, or an underutilized and forgotten side channel, which is a graveyard for new content. I can think of no better inaugural topic, therefore, than the Sega 32X. Before I dive into the specific games, I'd first like to talk about why the 32X failed. This is something I have read quite a bit about over the years, and while there are definitely people on this platform who know more about video game history than I do, a lot of it boils down to the conflict between Sega of Japan and Sega of America. Sega of Japan had a very Japan-centric view of the gaming industry. The Sega Genesis did well everywhere in the world except for Japan. In fact, in every single region except for Japan, the Genesis outsold the Super Nintendo, usually not by much, but by something. In Japan, it was a complete blowout, however, so overall, SNES outsold Genesis. So you would think, with that in mind, that Japan would begin to think more broadly, Sega of Japan, I mean, about how to make ends meet, how to market their products. But that's not what they did after the Genesis. If anything, they were angry at Sega of America for being more successful. Sega of America, for its part, wanted to assert its own authority to some extent, and Sega of Japan, which is the central headquarters, wanted nothing to do with it, and this led to a lot of headbutting throughout the Genesis and Saturn eras. The 32X fell into the crack. This was a project pushed by Sega of America, so Sega of Japan, in a certain way, wanted to undermine that project. And we'll see that there are some pretty questionable decisions made about which games were released in what regions. Due to the lack of success of Genesis in Japan, they only sold 700,000 consoles, you might think there should be no regional exclusives for the 32X, given that the number of people operating a 32X in Japan is going to be minuscule, yet there were at least a couple of exclusives to Japan. So again, Sega, so great at making decisions. We'll get into a few of those bad decisions as we go along, but in the meantime, I will jump in and begin looking at the 32X library. Rather than going through these alphabetically, as I often do with other tier lists, what I'll do instead is look at these somewhat by genre. First, let's talk about sports games. I want to get that out of the way because sports games are kind of boring, and as you can see from my clock, it's a little late, and I don't want to drag as we get toward the end if I'm talking about something that frankly kind of sucks. The Genesis was renowned for its sports titles, and the Saturn also had quite a few, although I think it's safe to say the PlayStation was the master of sports titles in the mid to late 90s. Nonetheless, 32X actually has a fairly good sampling of sports titles considering how few total games are available. We'll start out with FIFA Soccer 96. This is a competent game. I'm not a soccer fan at all, so I don't know how accurate this game is or how it stacks up with a lot of other soccer simulators. What I can say is that in the time that I spent with it, it's competent, it's fast and furious, it's fun, it has a gritty Genesis rock soundtrack, and it also has good presentation when you fire this thing up. So the game tries to get you excited, and when you take the field, you move quickly, and it's pretty easy to pick up the controls, switch from defense to offense. I like it. I think this is something that I could play more of if I had to. Say if I had a friend who was really into soccer and we had a 32X, I could have easily played that with my friend. No problem. Even though, again, I'm not a big soccer guy. So I think FIFA Soccer 96 is a B tier. And by the way, when I'm rating some of these, I will talk about what genre they are, because if we're talking about games which really move systems, games which really make a huge impact, there are certain genres which are by design niche. Sports are one of those genres. They have a hardcore following. It can help to support a system, but they're not system sellers, typically speaking. The Genesis might be the one sort of exception in that regard, where the sports titles were a major selling point over the SNES, since Genesis ran faster and you want your sports games to be quick. Aside from the Genesis, though, not many systems really leaned heavily on, look at our sports lineup. Next up, while we're doing sports titles, let's move on to a game which has a couple of different titles. That is Fred Couples. Okay, let's start with the actual titles here. One title is Golf Magazine, 36 Great Holes starring Fred Couples. Another title is 36 Great Holes starring Fred Couples. When you fire up the game, Fred Couples appears in a grainy little video screen and says he's presenting the game Golf Magazine 36 Great Holes. Pick whichever one you like. The fact remains that the game sucks, regardless of what you call it. Now, I'm also not a golf fan. I feel like golf is probably the most boring sport that there is. But I think I would recognize a good game if I saw one. If it's a good golf game, it'd be one that's fairly easy to pick up on and which has intuitive menus, and this one has neither of those features. I was playing what I thought was a tutorial, but the game explains nothing, and without having any knowledge of the golf clubs I was using, I wasn't really able to make any progress. I was just whacking the ball 20 yards at a time, and it was an exercise in frustration. There's very little sound or music, not a lot of presentation, and the only golfer available for play was Fred Couples. It seems like they would at least generate some randos if they didn't have the licensing to get Tiger Woods or other real golfers. So, seems like a bit of a turd to me. This is not Mario Golf or one of those golf titles that people can pick up and play and have a good time. It's possible that I'm missing something about this game and it's actually a really good golf simulator, and I'd have to be a golf guy to understand that. But as things stand right now, I'm not a golf guy, and this game is not fun at all. So, Fred Couples, you're going in the E tier. I don't know what his career was like, but given the nature of this game, I suspect he was a pretty good golfer at the time. It's hard to get on the title of a sports game unless you're pretty damn good at what you do. Mitch Richmond and Eddie Jones are probably sort of the lowest tier athletes I've ever seen get on a cover of something like NBA Live. The NBA is actually the only sport, or the only professional league that I follow in any detail. So let's go ahead and look at NBA Live TE, Tournament Edition. This game was released for pretty much every console at the time. There's a Saturn version, which is actually better than the arcade if you're willing to put in enough time to experience lengthy games of a short arcade experience, which is best enjoyed drunk or as a small child. Overall, I think that the 32X version is in the running for one of the best versions of the game. It has pretty good graphics. The lineups are updated. They're more up to date than the Genesis or Super Nintendo versions. The music is pretty good. And unlike the Saturn version, you can get through games relatively quickly. I was doing a challenge for a game site that I participate in, and the challenge is to play at least 5 hours on a given console, and I knew no one else would do 32X because this site is mostly PC, PS4, and Nintendo people. So I decided to represent the 32X, and since in previous years I had done real games, I decided, what would it be like to actually play and beat NBA Jam Tournament Edition, start to finish? So I used my emulator so I could utilize save states, played through it, spent 7 hours in total playing and beating all the teams. Probably lost about 8 games on the way to beating all 30 teams. Anyway, I got to experience the game in all of its glory or shame or whatever you want to call it. And I have to say, this is one of the better versions of a game which is ultimately just meh. This is a C-tier game. If you have a 32X and you have NBA Jam TE, you have a good version of the game. That being said, this is not as good as you might remember it if you haven't played it in a while. It is a game that is best played in short bursts. And not really much to it. Kind of minimal. Speaking of other sports games, let's look at Motocross Championship. This is a game which has a solid arcade feel. It reminds me of this one arcade game I played in a video store / restaurant / arcade that they had near where I used to live when I was in middle school. The game itself was from the late 80s. I can't remember the name of it, but I think there was an NES port. Anyway, Motocross is kind of a throwback to that. And while at first it looks like it might be fun, it's got an arcade feel, it's kind of Road Rash on dirt with some jumping. I have to say that while it does have some Road Rash-esque qualities, it's Road Rash without any of the good things about Road Rash. The controls are difficult, there's some draw distance, it doesn't sound good, it's very minimalist. This is something which could pass for an early Genesis game. This doesn't even look like a Genesis game from the late period, say 1994. So I don't know why it needed the power of the 32X to run. It technically isn't exclusive, so I guess it has that going for it. But it is pretty crappy. I couldn't get a feel for it. It was kind of jerky. I'm not sure if there are upgrades you do later or not. But it's just not a good game. Interestingly enough, apparently Next Generation said that if you were to compare Motocross with Road Rash on the 3DO, which at that time was sort of the standard for great motorcycle action, it would be like comparing a Schwinn bicycle to a Harley, with the Motocross being the Schwinn. I feel like that is an insult to Schwinn. I used to have a Schwinn that one of my neighbors gave me for babysitting their cats. Pretty decent bike. But Motocross is fucking shit. This is an E game, and I think I'm even being a little generous with the E here. Moving on, let's talk about NFL Quarterback Club, which I believe might be the last. No, it's not the last. We got 2 baseball games after this. So the first and last football game, however, is NFL Quarterback Club. This game also released on other systems, and there was a sequel to it. I think it was Quarterback Club 96, which released for the 5th gen systems. This is a pretty good version of the game. However, it is unlicensed, so they don't have real players, so it's just kind of generic numbers. And there are some competition modes you can play on Genesis, which aren't present here. That being said, it does have better graphics, sound, and presentation than the Genesis version, so it really depends on what you're looking for. Some of the fans of Quarterback Club liked those competitions, but if you're more interested in just a regular football simulator or arcade-style football game, then this would be the better version of the game. That being said, it's not all that much better than the Genesis version. It just looks and sounds a little better. It's competent, however, so I will give it the benefit of the doubt and put it in the C tier. It's nothing special, nothing worth collecting if you have to spend more than a few bucks for it, but if you like football games, this isn't that bad. Now we move on to baseball. As a kid who used to read GamePro, Game Players, and its sequels before it flamed out, and then Next Generation, I remember hearing nothing but praise for World Series Baseball. And since then, I've met other Sega fans who were huge fans of that particular franchise. They considered it to be one of the shining beacons of the Sega Sports series. I never have been into baseball at all. It's up there with golf for me in terms of things that I just have no interest in. However, I did, as a teenager, play some of the triple play games at friends' houses for PlayStation, so I can appreciate what a baseball game is supposed to feel like, and I can see how people got into those games. The PlayStation era baseball games were pretty solid. The two competitors for baseball on the 32X were Rbi Baseball 95 and World Series Baseball 95, featuring Deion Sanders, or starring Deion Sanders. It wasn't 95, just World Series Baseball starring Deion Sanders. I'll start out with that one since that's the one I played expecting to be impressed. I remember reading about the 32X version, the Genesis version, and the Saturn version of this game and its various sequels, and I remember the reviewers universally saying that this is an excellent baseball game, which is better than anything available, or at least as good as the better-selling, better-known PlayStation games. This game sucks. In fact, this is one of the worst games on 32X in my opinion. On the positive side, you do have better animations and special effects than you do on the Genesis. The announcer also has more bass in his voice, and it sounds more like a human voice. The game was originally designed for 32X and then ported over to Genesis, but somehow that port, which had fairly minimal changes, was a lot better. The 32X version has a much lower frame rate, so pitchers look awkward when they're pitching. Now they're more detailed, but they seem to move in slow motion. And that's not a huge deal. So for instance, if you were a 32X collector and you had to choose between the 32X and Genesis versions of this game, maybe the 32X version would be the way to go if they're equally priced, because it's kind of a novelty. You can plug in your 32X and play some baseball. Here's the problem, though. This game is virtually unplayable, at least so far as I can tell. Maybe I'm missing something that other people see. So first of all, there's an awful crowd roar the entire time you're playing. And it doesn't sound like people applauding, it's just absolutely obnoxious. A lot of sports games are guilty of that from this era. However, this one more so than most because the roar is constant and it doesn't really change with the action. So it's basically the equivalent of static in the background. The menu system for setting up games is awful in terms of choosing teams and all that. You can get around it, but it is not fun, and it reeks of last-minute design. Here's the real killer of the game for me. And again, I don't know baseball very well, so maybe there's some subtlety here that this game simulates brilliantly that just flew right over my head. But I doubt it. Any pitch that you throw in the box that the batter decides to ignore counts as a ball. So if you throw anything that's remotely tricky, and you can choose your pitches before you throw them, they don't bat, it's a ball, and if you get 4 of them, they walk, and they can eventually round all the bases doing that. If you do throw a pitch and they hit it, it can be a little tricky figuring out the outfield controls. They're not that hard to get adjusted to. It's actually the best part of the controls. But still, the first few times somebody pops one out into the outfield, you will have to adjust for the fact that you need to be standing in the right spot, but that the camera won't pan out there until a few seconds later, so you don't know where your guy's starting out at. So you have to react quickly, and when you're asked to react, your guy might be massively out of position. It's deeply annoying. And I've watched some footage of the Genesis version, and that one, because of the higher frame rate, is much easier in that regard. Here's another thing it has going against it. So the opposite problem. When you're at bat, I thought after the horrible experience I had pitching that all I have to do is stand here, ignore everything, and I can walk all the bases and cheat my way through the game. No. If you don't swing at anything in the box, it's an automatic strike. They threw no balls to me. Only strikes. Every time. Now you have a good chance of hitting it when you do bat it, but you can't control your bat very well. And I don't know of a way to really control how hard you hit it or what direction. The controls here are just awful. Most of the time you'll hit a flyer, you'll pop it up, somebody will catch it, and then you're out immediately. And if you don't bat, it's a strike. I don't know how anybody can enjoy this game. This game is the definition of F tier for me. This might be a bit of a hot take, but this is absolutely one of the worst games on 32X. And since a lot of these games are pretty bad, that is not an honor. The last of the sports games for the 32X is the incredible Rbi Baseball 95. And that's not pure sarcasm, although I'm being a little sarcastic. Again, baseball games are niche, so they're not for everyone, they're not system sellers, but I can appreciate something that's done well. And Rbi Baseball seems pretty solid to me. This is a game which has fairly intuitive play. I played it directly after World Series Baseball, and I caught on to it pretty quickly. It's a lot easier to pitch, to bat, to man the outfield, to change up your lineups, to select game modes. You also have real players. World Series Baseball is not licensed, so it's just all generic, but Rbi Baseball is. So even though this is the off-brand, this is not a Sega sports game, this one is vastly better, and I rank it a C. If you're into baseball and you want to play a game on 32X, go with RBI and not with World Series. Usually, World Series has that reputation, but in this case, it is not deserved. I can't speak for other World Series games. As I said, the Genesis version seems to be significantly better, but the 32X version is a real turd. Let's finish off games which are kind of sports related. We'll now do wrestling. Wrestling, I guess, now is more or less considered a sport, which maybe was not the best decision for the wrestling industry, but that seems to be the direction that they're going to avoid having Congress breathe down their neck about violence. There were 2 WWF games released for the 32X. This is before they rebranded as WWE. The first is WWF Raw. Raw followed in that long and not proud tradition of games like WWF Wrestlemania and Royal Rumble, released for the Genesis and Super Nintendo. These are games which were slow-paced, involved a lot of grunting, choking, punching, and kicking, and very little intuitive or smooth gameplay. Raw is the best of the old herky-jerky games. That being said, still kind of sucks. And it's a generally bad game. On the 32X, it is a little better than the Genesis and the SNES games. And I had this one as a kid, so because I was a big wrestling fan at the time, and there weren't too many better alternatives available until I got the PlayStation 1 around 1997 or so, this was what I played for a few years when I had the urge to do a wrestling game. I guess it is playable, but that's about all I can say for it. It is a D for me. One that I wanted as a kid but could never find was WWF Wrestlemania, the arcade game. This is a much better game in general. It's much faster paced, and while it does not attempt to simulate wrestling in any way, it is effectively a decent fighting game, maybe slightly above average fighting game. The Genesis version was flawed because it was missing a lot of effects from the arcade, but it had all the game modes and it played relatively swiftly. The SNES version was missing characters and played very sluggishly. It also had no multiplayer. So the 32X version was massively better than both of those, and was easily on par, or at least approaching what you might experience with the PlayStation and Saturn. The Saturn is usually considered the best version of this because the Saturn was a beast for 2D games, but the 32X version was pretty competent. I really wish I'd been able to find this one as a kid. I would have enjoyed it quite a bit. It had higher resolution, bigger sprites than the Genesis, better music. It had no slowdown, so that is a pretty good selling point. And I think that it's probably the second best port of this game behind the Saturn version. So I will rate WWF the arcade game as a B. And by the way, anything that is B or above, I think you should check out. The 32X was not a great system, but it did have a few games which were pretty solid, so some of these are worth a look if you're interested in that game or genre. Now that we've gotten through those, let's consider a new genre. Oh, I forgot Tough Man Contest. I guess that's a sports game. The Tough Man series is based on a real fighting organization. And the game itself is effectively a clone of Punch-Out for NES and SNES. And the game is a mild facelift of the Genesis original. It's not a bad boxing game, but it's also not a good one. That being said, my experiences with boxing games are very mixed. There's an Evander Holyfield game on Genesis that a lot of people like. I think it's absolute trash. And there's also James Buster Douglas's Knockout Boxing, which most people hate, and I happen to like. I haven't played a lot of Punch-Out in my life, so I'm not super familiar with the system that Tough Man Contest uses, but I kind of enjoyed this game, and the 32X version is definitely a step up from the Genesis, so I think it is a C. If you like the genre and you're looking for a Punch-Out style experience somewhere else, Tough Man Contest is an option. And again, this is based on a real fighting or boxing league, kind of a minor league for boxing. I believe they had Butterbean as kind of their poster boy. So, it's kind of a curiosity, something that is an obscure part of Americana. Next, let's go to one of the more notorious genres of this era. FMV, or full motion video games, where you effectively watch a pre-recorded video and then press buttons to interact and control the world around you to some extent. These games are fundamentally unplayable, but at one time this was seen as an alternative to moving into a 3D gaming future. Most of these games came out for the Sega CD and the 3DO, but most people would have experienced them on Sega CD, if at all, because Sega CD was much more affordable than the $700 3DO. When the 32X came out, you could combine the power of 32X with Sega CD to create higher quality FMV games, and despite the fairly low market share for FMV games, some games were ported with enhancements and made available in this way. There are 4 such games that we'll talk about right now. First of all, Corpse Killer. This is one that I played as a kid and that I still enjoy from time to time. It relies very heavily on Caribbean stereotypes. It's pretty strange. The gameplay is rough, but it is actually playable, unlike a number of these, because it is a kind of rail shooter. So it's a combination of full motion video with rail shooting mechanics. Very strange, but pretty amusing in small doses. This is a definite upgrade from the Sega CD version. You can see a lot more of the screen, the resolution's a lot better, and it actually comes surprisingly close to the Graveyard Edition for Saturn, which is kind of the definitive edition of Corpse Killer, but it's not quite on that level. So you can hook up your Sega CD 32X with 3 huge power bricks, but you'll ultimately fall short of the experience you would get with the Saturn with just a regular plug. That being said, I own Corpse Killer, and I enjoy this version of it. I think it's a C. Of all the FMV games, it is one of the better ones. You can have a good laugh with friends. I don't recommend playing it by yourself because there's not much to it, but if If you want to have the boys over, have a few beers, these FMV games are always a hit. Next up is Fahrenheit. This is a game about firefighters, and firefighting games are relatively rare. There was a very popular one for the SNES, and then there's also Burning Rangers for the Saturn, which is kind of a hidden gem. But unfortunately, this firefighting game breaks the rule of these games being secretly really good, as this game sucks. There are some improvements in the visuals, but there's also a lot of really bad audio static, which was not cleaned up at all. The game lacks any kind of humor, so it doesn't really appeal in the same way as most of these other FMV games from the time. There's nobody like the guy from Sewer Shark yelling at you and calling you dog meat, for instance. The choices that you make seem kind of senseless. You go around a burning building, you try to find people inside, but you can easily get turned around, and sometimes the choices that you make don't seem to correspond with the actions that your character takes in terms of moving through the burning house. It's just a terrible game. It's not anything wrong with this particular port. I rate Fahrenheit as an E. It's sort of the definition of an unplayable FMV game. Next up, let's take a look at Night Trap. Night Trap is perhaps the most notorious of the FMV games from this period. There was actually a congressional hearing about Night Trap, as well as Mortal Kombat and Doom, both of which are represented in this list. But Night Trap apparently offended the delicate sensibilities of Joe Lieberman. Ironically, of course, Joe Lieberman has never seen a war he didn't want to get involved in, but fuck forbid that the children see girls in their bras or see vampires trying to abduct and murder somebody. Real bloodshed is fine, but let's not be lewd. Anyway, Night Trap is hilarious. It does have a much higher learning curve than something like Supreme Warrior or something like Slam City or Tomcat Alley or a lot of the other FMV games. That being said, it is the only video game that I'm aware of where during gameplay, if you let it idle to some extent, you can watch the girls sing a theme song for the game. The acting is hilariously bad. Everything is ultra mid-90s. The game itself, however, takes a lot of getting used to, so I have to rank it a D. That being said, this is one of the best versions of this game. The 3DO version is probably the pinnacle, so if you have an emulator, that would be the way to go. But if you don't know how to run an emulator for 3DO, then get the Sega CD32X version, and you'll come pretty close. This is another one that is great for company. Next up is Slam City with Scotty Pippen. This game seems especially relevant in 2020 because Scottie Pippen was badly disrespected in Michael Jordan's recent documentary, The Last Dance. What do you got to get? You got to get respect, and that's what this game is all about. You battle on the streets with 4 street hoopers, and you earn respect or lose it with each play. This game is fairly controllable compared to the average of FMV games. That being said, it is not an accurate simulator for basketball. I've played quite a bit of street ball, and there's nothing remotely like what you see in Slam City occurring on any basketball court in the world right now. However, the trash talk here and the acting is phenomenally hilarious. There's one guy who's a hyper-intense meathead who will block your shots and then say, "Ha ha ha, you want some peanut butter with that jam?" All the other characters also have ridiculous personalities. There's also this little sleazy guy in the most 90s kind of Jimmy Hart style get-up you've ever seen, betting on your game, and he wins $50 and he goes, "Heh, $50 for the rent." And you have a girlfriend in the game who threatens not to sleep with you unless you win. Everything about the game setup is perfect. The game itself, very hard to play and master. And of course, control input is crap. That being said, it is playable and beatable. I've never done it, but I have beaten a few of the individual ballers before. If you beat all 4 ballers, each one is contained on their own disc, then you get to face Scotty Pippen. And basically before that, you watch about a 5-minute long Reebok commercial. Scotty Pippen had a Reebok contract. And then you play him. Apparently he's actually easier than a lot of the street ballers for whatever reason. And the implication is that if you can beat Scottie Pippen, you then get a roster spot on the Chicago Bulls. But don't get too excited. This was that period when Jordan was retired, when the Bulls were really good but not really contenders. So you would not have gotten a ring, but you would have gone to the second round of the playoffs. I personally like this game a lot, but that doesn't make it good. This is also a D tier. And it's one where if you want to have people over and make fun of some really terrible acting, but also maybe even play the game and see who can do the best, who can sort of master this weird-ass game, this is an excellent game night game. One warning is that if you do get a copy of this, if you order a copy, make sure it has the instruction manual, because that comes with hints you can't find online as to how to beat each baller. At least I don't think those instructions are available online. The last time I checked, they're not. I unfortunately sold my Sega CD 32X copy of this, and I currently only have the regular Sega CD version. But once again, the 32X version is enhanced, and there's also a 3DO version, which is probably the version of record. Last but not least, among the proud FMV masterpieces that you can play in an enhanced format on the Sega 32X, Supreme Warrior. This has better resolution than Sega CD. It's funny as hell, but it really isn't a good fighting game. It's a first-person fighting game where you see your arms and legs flail out as you fight people. They talk mad shit to you while you fight them. You can choose your direction to some extent. It's a lot like Corpse Killer. It's basically the fighting game version of Corpse Killer. It also has a lot of theme to it, which today kind of seems a little racist at times, but it's still kind of funny. You have to wonder where they got these actors. At least Night Trap has Dana Plato, but pretty much all these other games we're talking about here, if you look up the IMDb pages of these people, these games effectively killed their careers. And I believe that the same is true of Supreme Warrior, although because it's so funny, just like with Slam City, if I had been in one of these games, I would be proud to show it to my friends and family and have a good laugh. But anyway, it's a D tier. Not a good fighting game, very counterintuitive, but pretty fun nonetheless. All right. Let's move into arcade games. In one of the ads, the ad shows a little boy shocked at a 32X and the Genesis joining together, and he says, "Mommy, what are those two game systems doing?" And she says, "They're making an arcade machine, sweetie." The implication being, these two systems are getting it on. But in reality, what Sega was trying to do is not only use a little bit of edgy sex talk to sell stuff like they had been doing for years, but also to insinuate that the 32X could do arcade-perfect ports, and that was kind of true to an extent with a couple of games we're about to talk about. They released two older arcade games in relatively arcade-perfect form for the system upon its launch, and if I'm not mistaken, both of these games were released at a discount. Those two games are Afterburner and Space Harrier. I did not request either of those for Christmas because I already had versions of them on other systems. I had Afterburner 3 on Sega CD, which by the way is the best Afterburner. And I also had Space Harrier for the Master System, and I had the old power base converter, whatever it was called. But my parents found these for $19.99 a piece and used them as stocking stuffers, so I got two extra games. And I'm happy I got them because these are some of the better ports of these games and remain so for a number of years until you got the virtual consoles the last couple generations. Afterburner, however, is a 1987 arcade game being released in late 1994 to advertise the sheer processing power of a new game console. Not a system seller. And also, Afterburner is a bit limited. It's not really the best or deepest game in the world. I kind of like it because I played it as a kid, but it is not one I could spend hours playing. I can maybe spend 20 to 30 minutes on Afterburner, acknowledge it for what it is, and then I'll be bored and want to play something with a little more depth. For me, Afterburner is a C tier, and because of its age, I might actually be inclined to rank it a little lower if it weren't for the low cost point. With the low cost point, I could even see going higher for this one, but again, 1987 game in late 1994, not very impressive. Space Harrier is much the same. This game, I think, came out in 1988, and is probably about an arcade perfect port. I have heard some people say that there are a couple of little details which aren't quite arcade perfect, but I'm not a tech expert, so I can't really prove or disprove that point. What I can say is that to my layman's eye, it is pretty damn close to being an arcade perfect port. But, it's an old game. It was already 6 years old or more by the time that it came out, and had this released in this form on the Genesis even a couple years later, this would have been pretty impressive, possibly a system seller. Maybe it would have helped in Japan, where they were really into these games in the arcades. But Space Harrier is also pretty run-of-the-mill by late 94, so I have to give this one a C as well. If anything, I think Space Harrier is a better game than Afterburner, but, nothing special. And these are both games I would recommend collecting if you can. They're probably a little bit more expensive now because they are, playable and still relevant, still recognizable. But, they're not exactly must-owns. And I am 100% in favor of emulation if you can't find these games or you don't feel like getting a retro hookup. Let's see, another arcade game which came to the 32X. Actually, the most famous game on the system, arguably, is Star Wars the Arcade Game, a Sega exclusive, which was only ever ported to the 32X. To the best of my knowledge, to this very day, the only way to play this game is on the 32X unless you include something like MAME. And, interestingly enough, the 32X version has an additional extended 32X mode. While the effects and everything else aren't as good as in the arcade, there is more gameplay here, and I would say this is actually a better game than the arcade original. This was definitely intended to be a tech demo for the 32X, and in that regard, the game is a success. This game looks pretty impressive. It has 3D models. It's fairly fun. It really impressed me when I first played it. It seemed high-tech, it seemed futuristic, and I was pretty excited about the future of gaming. However, as I continued to play it, I realized this game is rather limited. It's a lot like Afterburner and Space Harrier. It's one of those which you can't really play for super long periods of time because there's not much there. It's fast-paced and furious, and that's about it. Not really my style of game, but it is a good game for what it is. I rate Star Wars Arcade a B tier. If you're a collector, this one is obviously a must-own since it is the only port of that game. I really wish that Sega had tried to port this one to the Saturn. I believe it would have had a lot more success, but they didn't for reasons. You can always count on Sega to make bad decisions. They should also consider porting it to modern consoles, make it one of those $5 releases like Fighting Vipers or Virtua Fighter 2. I'm sure they would sell a good number of copies that way on Xbox, PlayStation, Switch, etc. But again, Sega only makes dumb decisions when they have the option of making such a decision. Let's see, another famous arcade port at this time was Mortal Kombat 2. Mortal Kombat 2 was still pretty hot at this time, even though I think Mortal Kombat 3 was already out in the arcades. The 32X port of Mortal Kombat 2 came months after the Genesis and SNES ports. That being said, it was worth the wait. The Genesis port is very smooth and playable, but it is missing a lot of features, and it looks kind of washed out. The SNES version is not a direct port. It kind of adjusts the game for the strengths of the SNES. I think it's an excellent game, but it isn't quite a literal port in a lot of ways. The 32X version, in my humble but right opinion, is the best version of Mortal Kombat 2. It has no slowdown. It is smooth. It has most of the effects of the arcade. There aren't any loading times, unlike, say, the Saturn port, which I think is shit. It has great color. It has a lot of the little things in the background that are missing. It has all the voices. The voice samples are good. It supports the 6-button controller. And 6-button controller is definitely the way to go with this game. Everything about it's great. For me, Mortal Kombat 2 is an A tier. This is a game I played a lot of as a kid. My fondest memory of this game was during one of the darker periods of my childhood. I had pneumonia when my family first moved to Alaska. And while I'd had this game for months already, this was the one I'd go to in those brief spells during that 2-week period where I had enough energy to kind of feel like myself. And so I'd just pick up Mortal Kombat 2 or maybe Doom and play, and it would make me feel normal for a short period of time. So yeah, and having played more ports of the game since this time, I still stand by this being the best port. So this is one game which I think is a must-own for the system if you do in fact own the system. Also, of course, you need to like fighting games to really appreciate why this is better than the other versions of MK2. I was a huge fighting game fan as a kid. Now I don't really like them much, but Mortal Kombat 2 is one which I will always love due to the nostalgia factor. And I don't care what anyone says, MK2 is easily the best game in the series, bar none. With the possible exception of Ultimate 3. Regular Mortal Kombat 3 kind of sucks. Okay, moving on from that, let's talk about two more ports, which were also Sega exclusives. These games are Virtua Fighter and Virtua Racing. Virtua Fighter was hugely successful in Japan. This was a system pack-in game, I believe, and a system seller for the handful of people in Japan who owned the Genesis and couldn't get enough Sega products. They also got the Mushroom. The port of Virtua Fighter was not arcade perfect because that was cutting-edge technology at the time. However, this was a very solid and competent port. It retains most of the look and feel of the arcade, and if anything, playing this on a 32X with a Genesis 6-button controller is a much better experience than trying to play this with a joystick at the arcade. It's an excellent controller, very responsive, and this game takes full advantage. While you do have the moon jumps, some of the other ridiculous features of Virtua Fighter, this is an eminently playable game. And while I generally don't like this series all that much, I did get a lot of enjoyment out of this game. I give this one an A. This is a solid tech demo for the 32X. It showed that it's capable of doing quite a bit more than the old Genesis, and also had some 3D capabilities that were not included with the Sega CD. For the most part, with a lot of these games, when we talk about the extra features they have, I think it would be totally fair to say, why not just port this on Sega CD and not release the 32X at all? Sega CD had a larger install base and could run most of this stuff, and that's even true of, say, Mortal Kombat 2, although that would necessitate loading times. But with Virtua Fighter, this is a good demonstration of the 32X's capabilities, and a good game which has held up pretty well. I don't think this is better than Virtua Fighter Remix on Saturn, but I would rank this above the original port of Virtua Fighter on Saturn, which was blocky and just looked kind of chunky and crappy. Also, there is a Virtua Fighter 2 port on Genesis, which is crap. It's not at all 3D, of course. And Sega touts that one a lot and puts it in a lot of its packaging. Those like Genesis collections that it keeps releasing. That game sucks. It does not deserve to be included in anything. and Sega should instead include either the Saturn port of Virtua Fighter 2 or the arcade port. Or, hell, if you're going to do a port from the home systems, put the Virtua Fighter for 32X port. Remind people that there were a few good games on 32X. Another game which released for 32X as something which people at the time, especially in Japan, were interested in, was Virtual Racing Deluxe. Unlike the Genesis version of the game, which had to have a special chip to do 3D, or what passed for 3D at that time, this one ran natively on the 32X. I'm not a racing fan in general. There have only been a few racing games over the course of my life that I've actually liked. Top Gear for Super Nintendo being probably the most played racing game for me. But Virtual Racing Deluxe, not a bad port. Compared with the arcade original, it definitely captures the feel. And most of the people who are big fans of Virtual Racing enjoy this game immensely. I actually saw one guy who prefers this version to the enhanced version available for Switch now. It has some draw distances which are pretty rough, but for the most part it's fast and furious, and I can definitely feel the quality of the controls. It's easy to figure out how to do sharp turns, how to balance braking and acceleration. So it is a good racing game, but while it does have its hardcore defenders, ultimately racing is kind of a niche genre, and I have to rank this one a C. Pretty good tech demo in many ways, but by the time that Saturn and PlayStation games started to be available, you could tell that Virtual Racing Deluxe on 32X was not up to snuff with the kind of tech that you were seeing in something even as pedestrian as, say, Warhawk or the first Tekken, much less the beautiful Panzer Dragoon or something of that nature. While we're on the topic of racing, let's get BC Racers out of the way. BC Racers is a kind of half sequel or perhaps port of the Sega CD original. It's hard to say which version of the game is better, and I'm at a loss to try to explain why anyone thought that a second version of the game on a less popular console was needed. Basically, the trade-offs here are that the Sega CD version sounds better and has better presentation. They have the same controls, but the 32X version has better backgrounds, although the characters are slightly lower resolution. So overall, if I had to play one for whatever reason, I'd probably go with the 32X version by a hair, if it's just an even choice between the two. But there aren't very many real differences that I can tell. I think there are some differences in background. Maybe they have different stages, but the mechanics and everything are identical. This is a pretty lazy effort. It doesn't really enhance what you could play before. And I have to give this one a D. It is serviceable, but that's about it. There's not really much here. Seems pretty minimal. Definitely it's better than Motocross, but it is not on the same level as Virtual Racing Deluxe. Let's see. And I guess from this point forward, I will just go through the rest of these in alphabetical order, and that way we'll just get done. We haven't gone through some of the more interesting titles, but we have gone through, I think, probably the best ones, so it might be downhill from here, fair warning. First up, we have Blackthorn. I assume this game has fans. I'm not one of them. This is an awful action platformer. It just really moves like molasses. Everything is slow. Like Prince of Persia slow, but without any of the charm or sophistication. I've also played the SNES version of the game for comparison, and aside from having more full and lifelike character models, this game improves nothing from the SNES. And because the SNES original was absolute shit, that means this game is also absolute shit. F tier. I don't know why anybody would want to play this game. It's lost on me. Maybe there are fans of it, but again, I'm not one of them, and I honestly don't know how anybody could enjoy this game. Next up, we have Brutal, Above the Claw. Just like BC Racers, this is a sequel to a Sega CD game. Although BC Racers was not a clear sequel, this one is designed to be a sequel. And you might think, why release a sequel to a game that no one ever played or heard of, and then give it a title implying that it is a sequel? I don't know. I also don't know who designed and released this one, but they did not do a good job. The game has great presentation. I was actually kind of excited when I fired this one up, because I figured, oh crap, they put some effort into this. This game might be a hidden gem. And then you actually get into the fighting. Well, let's talk about character select first. When you're in character select, this is when the presentation shines. Each character has a full bio, and you learn about their likes and dislikes. So it's kind of like the Virtua Fighter select screen, except with a lot more detail. There's a backstory. This game had actual writers and writing, which is unusual for a fighting game. Then you get into the action, and wow, it sucks. This looks, feels, and plays like a comfortably below average 16-bit fighter. There were a lot of fighting games in this era, and most of them were not Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat, Virtua Fighter, or Eternal Champions, or Killer Instinct, or any of the other ones that are famous for being good, Samurai Showdown. Most of the games that were not in that group were trash. And unfortunately, this was one of those games. Brutal, Above the Claw is an E. Next up, we have Cosmic Carnage. This is another kind of off-brand fighting game. And while I don't know for sure, I believe this is also a 32X exclusive. Unfortunately, for the 32X, some of the exclusives that it got were dog shit, and this is one of those. The graphics here are 3D, but they're mediocre 3D. The coloring is extremely poor. The 32X famously gave the Genesis a huge color palette, which made it have more colors than the SNES. It was one of the selling points of SNES for a long time, is that the color palette blew away the Genesis, but with the 32X's added power, the 32X was now superior in the color department, and then they didn't really use it on a lot of the games. So much for that. The frame rate is shit. The controls are unresponsive, even though you have an excellent controller to work with for fighting games. The character models have great articulation. They move very realistically. However, nothing else that this game does couldn't have been done on the Genesis. And actually, now that I think about it, a lot of Genesis games do have very fluid character movement, so you could probably do this game on a Genesis and lose nothing. This is also a crappy fighting game, and it's an E. Next up, we have a European exclusive, Darkside. This is a... Okay, I just misread something a minute ago. Cosmic Carnage is not a 3D fighter, it's a 2D fighter. Darkside, however, is 3D, and because I have my notes for these next to each other, I accidentally read off the wrong line a minute ago. But anyway, Darkside is a 3D shooter where you fly in a spacecraft, and because there's no story and not a lot of text, it's unclear exactly what your goal is, but apparently you're supposed to shoot down asteroids and also some UFOs that come and challenge you. The game is kind of barren. The coloring is crap. Just like in Cosmic Carnage, the graphics are pretty mediocre. The action is very dull, the music is generic, and it seems very difficult to pass anything. You have to hunt down all the asteroids, but your radar is really hard to use. The game just feels a little unfinished, and I can kind of understand why it was not released outside of Europe. Although, if you're trying to maximize profits, it would seem like you might want to go to the US, where you have the largest user base, and trick people into buying this game. But maybe Sega either had some ethics on this one, or else this was just a one-off by some really obscure studio. I don't know. It is an exclusive. It was exclusive to Europe. And it's so exclusive that I'm going to put it in the E category. Next up, we have the infamous port of Doom for the 32X. A lot of people hate this game. And a lot of the people who hate it have never played it. They just compare the music and sound effects to the SNES and then say that this game sucks. They also point out that it's missing a bunch of content. And they use it as an emblem of why the 32X sucked. The graphics are also cropped, so they say, look, the 32X was feeble. The truth is that this game could have been great. The 32X had the power to run this, but the development was rushed to make Christmas '94. I was very excited to get this game. I convinced my parents to get it for me, even though I was 8 at the time. And I'm really glad that they did. Although this game is truncated from the original, it is still an excellent game. The controls are crisp. In fact, I prefer the controls in this version to any other version. And I'm not saying that ironically. This game plays well. Sure, a lot of levels are short and there are only 15 of them, but you will enjoy them. There is no the big fucking gun, the BFG. There is no BFG in the game, but you have everything else you could want. Some of the enemies are missing, but I didn't know that, and I still had a great time playing the game. Like a lot of people back then, I didn't have a gaming PC. My family's PC was pretty underpowered, and I had to compete with 2 younger sisters and my parents to use it. So, I wasn't really big into gaming. Also, I think at this time we were still using about a 386, something like that, so I don't even know if it would have run Doom. Anyway, unlike the SNES version, you will not get stuck on corners. And while this game is flawed, and maybe I am looking at it through nostalgic eyes, I rate this game an A. Any version of Doom is usually a good game, except for the SNES port, because it ran like ass and the controls were terrible. Also, the Saturn port was really terrible because the draw distance was abysmal. But the 32X version, pretty smooth. And in my mind, before I upgraded to Saturn and PlayStation, some of the more high-tech looking levels in Doom for 32X were sort of my idea of what the future of gaming would look like. And while a lot of the tunes have been butchered compared to what they're supposed to be, some of them are actually still pretty catchy if you don't know better. So if you just heard it in isolation and you didn't know what the game was supposed to sound like, still kind of catchy. And that's a testament to the high quality of the tracks themselves, that they can be put in a muffled kind of gravelly version and still have a nice beat to them. So anyway, I guess that would be one of my hotter takes from this video. Also, I still play this game from time to time. It only takes a couple hours to beat if you're familiar with it, and like I said, I've got a lot of fond memories. It plays well, and I actually recommend you check this one out if you've only seen the comparison videos, which just say the 32X sucks, because this game is actually pretty damn good. You do need a 6-button controller to run it, though, or a 6-button arrangement of some kind. But now with RetroBit, they have a lot of cheap $20 perfectly accurate emulator controllers and also reproductions of the originals, which I need to replace my original controllers because they're pretty much shot. Note to self. Next up, we have Knuckles Chaotix, another system exclusive and the only Sonic game to release for the 32X. This one experimented with the mechanic of being tied to another character. So you as Knuckles will have a partner, and the two of you will have to move in tandem. This means the game does not have the electric speed of previous entries. That being said, it is a fairly competent platformer, although it is somewhat controversial. A lot of people hate this game. They don't like the ring mechanic because they think of Sonic and they think speed. Also, of the new characters, some of them do suck, but others have been reused in other Sonic titles, so apparently they were seen as somewhat okay. The game has some pretty cool 3D bonus stages, which are better done than any other 16-bit Sonic game. Yes, including Sonic CD. Also, the special stages are integrated neatly into ring collection. So when you collect rings, that determines how much time you have to complete the bonus stage. And when you complete those stages, of course, you get extra lives. So this is a pretty good idea. That being said, two of the characters, Heavy and Bomb, are jokes, and the problem with them sucking is that while you could just avoid them, the way that you select partners is a little bit random. It's kind of like playing something like UFO Catcher, where you reach into the machine and try to grab a prize. Very difficult to control and very easy to mess up. So you might end up with one of them when you don't want them. And of course, that really sucks. So, yeah. That's a problem. Also, the level design is fairly uninspired. While the graphics and colors and everything else and character models all look really good, the level design and sort of world building here are fairly minimal. Also, the game just feels kind of empty in a way. There aren't many obstacles, there's some lag and frame rate drops. This one should have been in development a little longer. I think by the time it released, however, in 1995, Sega realized that this concept of the ring mechanic wasn't great. They also realized that the 32X probably wasn't going anywhere, and they just released this to keep 32X fans content. Maybe move a few consoles at the reduced price. Really what they should have done is kept this one around in development longer, maybe move it to the Saturn, and then have a kind of throwback fun game that's kind of innovative. Anyway, as it stands, Knuckles Chaotix was pretty damn mediocre, and I think it's about a C. Interesting experience, but ultimately really not that good. Although pretty playable. Next up is what I believe to be the oddest game on the 32X. You might think that releasing an odd niche game on an add-on console which was unlikely to succeed was not a wise move. However, some developers did trust Sega after all the success of the Genesis, and they thought that they could put their eggs in the 32X basket. Calibri is a pretty interesting game. You play as a hummingbird. No, I did not misspeak. You play as a literal hummingbird. And you shoot. This is a 2D side-scrolling shooter. It has a lot of theme, but low-key there might be a hint of ethnic cleansing here because you basically kill bees all the time. Anyway, whatever. It's kind of fun, kind of weird. It's niche. There are puzzle elements. And one thing that's a problem for people who want to play it today is that you basically need the manual to know what to do. Without the manual or some online equivalent or replacement for the manual, it will be very difficult to figure out how to start the game. So it kind of starts out like Echo the Dolphin, where you're just wandering around until you stumble upon the right thing to do. But unlike Echo, there's not a big fan community here, so it's not common knowledge among a lot of gamers what you need to do. I think it's safe to say that of all the many hummingbird shooters out there, this one is the best. But it's still more of a novelty than a classic. I think that this one is a C. Interesting game, kind of fun, but ultimately not that good. Next up, we have one of my personal favorites on the system, Metalhead. Metalhead is playable, it's 3D, it has polygons, and while those polygons are not high res, they do look pretty okay for the time. I think that the polygons used in Thunderstrike on the Sega CD were better, but these are pretty respectable for the 16-bit era. Although if we do count 32X as a 32-bit system, it's pretty rough. That being said, a lot of the early 32-bit games, especially that PlayStation launch lineup, looked blocky as hell. So it actually doesn't look terrible for the time, but by today's standards, when you're used to seeing things that are smooth, This is eye cancer inducing. However, it does have good gameplay. It's kind of funny. There's a backstory here, which is a little tongue-in-cheek, pretty fun. It's original, both in terms of the concept. It's sort of like a Mech Warrior style game, but on console, which up to this point had not really been done unless you count the Genesis and Super Nintendo game, which was on Super Nintendo called Mech Warrior 3050, and on Genesis had a different title. Anyway, you wandered around as basically Desert Strike with a mech rather than a helicopter. This game is really more like Mech Warrior 2, however. And if you're a fan of that, you will like this game. I actually like this game a lot better than Mech Warrior 2. I never really got into that one as much. For me, Metalhead is a B. I think a lot of people would probably be more inclined to rank it a C, but for me, it was enjoyable. And I remember picking this one up at a used game store. I was pretty skeptical of what I had. I assumed it was probably trash. And I was pleasantly surprised that it was one of the better games I'd played on the system. So, one of my personal favorites here, and not a bad game. If you do find it, like I did, at a discount, I recommend picking it up. And if not, emulate it. It's one of the ones I would say is unique and interesting enough to give a shot. Next up, we have Pitfall, the Mayan Adventure. Again, there are fans of this game. There are people out there in the world who have played this game and thought that it was alright. I think this game is fucking terrible. It's horrid, in fact. And if anything, if you're going to play Pitfall, don't play it on the 32X. I'm not sure if it's available in the Genesis. It might be. The one version I was able to find on emulator and then play as a point of comparison was the SNES version. And I think that comparatively, Pitfall on 32X makes a horrible utilization of the controller. So if you gotta play this game for whatever reason, go with the SNES version. I believe it's also available in the Jaguar and some other systems like that. Whatever you do, probably don't go 32X with this one. This one is an E tier for me, and I would be willing to go F tier, but I don't think it's quite as unplayable and shitty as Blackthorn or World Series Baseball. Next up is Primal Rage. This game, it has a slightly better intro than the Genesis version. It has slightly larger characters, but it's very hard to tell the two versions apart. If I saw them without the context of seeing them back to back or side to side, it would be very hard for me to determine which one was which, and it would also be easy to assume that one version was Genesis and the other version was, say, SNES or something like that. It's not a big upgrade at all, and also this game sucks to begin with. It's another one of those kind of off-brand, crappy fighting games from this era. Really not much to talk about, and just like its counterparts in the fighting genre on 32X, which were not either by Sega or part of a famous and solid franchise, Primal Rage is an E. I guess I could have put this in the arcade category earlier, but I have willfully forgotten that Primal Rage was an arcade game, because it sucked. Next up, we have Romance of the Three Kingdoms 4, or to use the Japanese title, Sangokushi 4. This game was a Japan-only exclusive. And since the game is about Chinese history, there's probably overall more interest in Chinese Three Kingdoms history in Asia than there is in North America. I'm one of the few people who really loves Koei games, and I really love the Three Kingdoms period of China especially. So for me, the fact that this was not released in the US is a major bummer, because if it were available in the US, I would own a copy of this as long as it was under $100. That being said, I have played other versions of ROTK4, including the Super Nintendo and PlayStation versions, and I think that the 32X version would have been a real winner. This would have made up for the fact that a lot of the games on this console were very short and kind of the Fast and Furious variety with not a lot of staying power. One of the problems with this library as a whole is there aren't a lot of games you can spend hours on, a lot of deep adventures. And because this is a strategy game, this would compensate for a lot. And ROTK 4 is a pretty deep one for that time. It had good graphics, good gameplay, and good mechanics. Koei was getting really good at what it was doing by this juncture. And if you were a fan of the genre, you could spend hours playing this one. You could also possibly rope in some people who were not huge fans of Koei games because they're looking for something to do with their new shiny 32X. Again, we have to consider the wisdom of Japan, or Sega of Japan, excuse me, because they decided to release an exclusive game in a place with only 700,000 Genesis users, without releasing a Genesis version of the game, by the way. Instead of releasing this game in a market in America, we have an install base of 20 million Genesis users, and therefore a much larger base of 32X users than you would have in Japan. Because again, over 20 times more people owned a Genesis. At any rate, I'm a big fan of this game. I think it's one of the best of the 16-bit, early 32-bit era. And I rate this game a B. Let's move on. I'm assuming, of course, the Japanese version is the same. I'm pretty sure it is, other than the language of the text. Next up, we have another one of my favorite games for the system. This game is Shadow Squadron, although it was released elsewhere in the world as Stellar Assault. This game I think of as being fun but incomplete. The music kind of sucks, and actually on my cartridge of this game there is no music. A couple of my cartridges have started to go bad. For instance, my MK2 cartridge sometimes randomly says characters' names in the middle of fights. Baraka, while I'm in the middle of fighting, and Baraka's not even in the game, or not even in that fight. But this one, for me, the sound stopped working, so I'd forgotten that there was music in the game until I used an emulator, because right now my 32X is in an operating form, it's not plugged in. And yeah, I'm actually glad that my cartridge doesn't have music on it, because the music in this game really sucks. That being said, this one has a couple of different options. You can either fly your space fighter in first-person mode, or you can play as the gunner and the AI will pilot. I think it might be two-player compatible. I'm not sure, though. I never really had anybody to play with when it came to 32X. My sisters were much younger, and they weren't of gaming age yet. So, with Shadow Squadron, this game, like I said, incomplete, but still very good. The polygons here are solid, and it's a much better looking 3D game than Darkside. I actually also think it looks better and plays better than Star Wars Arcade. It's a little more open-ended. Star Wars Arcade is fast and furious. This game has a little bit more pacing to it, so it's a little slower, but I prefer that personally. And I've gotten deeper in this game than I ever did in Star Wars Arcade because I find it much more enjoyable. I wish they'd spent a little bit more time refining it, but still, this is a good game. And it's unfortunate that this was never ported to another system, since this game had a good deal of potential. The only thing that comes close to kind of simulating what you can experience with this game would be the Colony War series on PS1. Of course, very different series altogether, much better rated, but I think somewhat comparable. For me, Shadow Squadron is a B, and just like with Doom, Metalhead, which I only discovered as an adult, Virtua Fighter, and MK2, those are pretty much the 32X games that I play on a somewhat regular-ish basis. Now for a game that I never play if I can avoid it, Spider-Man Web of Fire, the only game featuring Spider-Man on the 32X console. This is the worst Spider-Man game of the 4th generation, and I usually count 32X with the Genesis and Super Nintendo rather than with the Saturn and PlayStation. But actually, regardless of which way you count it, this is the worst Spider-Man game of either the 4th or 5th generation. I played all the rest to make sure of this point, and I do stand by that idea. This is absolutely the bottom of the barrel. Spider-Man feels like an early Genesis game, with the exception of some of the character models which kind of have that Batman Forever motion capture feel to them. But for whatever reason, Genesis was absolutely abysmal at that. And although you would think that with 32X's upgrades it would be able to pull that off, it doesn't. The game is kind of directionless. You just kind of move to the right across rooftops. There's no clear objective. The graphic design is terrible. The backgrounds are basically non-existent. The music is mediocre at best. The sound effects suck. The controls are average to below average. It's unplayable. All the reviews were very negative. I think that game players who should rate out of 100 gave it a 36. And that, I think, is a fairly generous 36. This game is an F. It sucks. And while it is an exclusive to the 32X and therefore a collector's item, it is one better left unplayed. Total dog shit. Next up, we have Star Trek Starfleet Academy Starship Bridge Simulator. If anything, 32X was pretty damn well represented in the space subgenre. In recent years, I have become a pretty big Star Trek fan, but I didn't actually start watching any Star Trek until 2016. So when this came out, I totally ignored the game, had no interest in it. I've only played it a little bit. This is not really my style of game. It's rather slow-paced and just not really for me. That being said, there's some obvious quality here, and it seems like it does the Star Trek theme justice. I think if you get deeper into the game, there might be more here, but as for right now, it's just not something I'm interested in playing much. And because the gameplay is rather slow and takes a lot of getting into, this one for me is kind of an automatic C tier, just for virtue of being niche. This is one I might revisit in the future, now that I'm much more of a Star Trek guy. Maybe at some point I'll do Star Trek games, since there are a fair number of them which are worth talking about and playing. It's also available for SNES. I'm not really sure of the differences. Obviously, since I haven't really played it much, if I'm going to play it, I'm playing the 32X version on emulator because I'm a Sega guy, and I'm always looking for a good excuse to play some 32X because I like to be the one guy in the world and any given night in 2020 who's playing 32X. Oh, I forgot when I was talking about FMV, there is one more FMV game which was released. This one is Surgical Strike, and it was released only in South America by Tectoy. It was advertised in the US, but never really released. Apparently, when you bought the Sega CD version of Surgical Strike, there was something you could mail in and pay an additional however many dollars, and in exchange, supposedly you would then get the disc to play it with 32X upgrades. However, that got canceled. The company sent out something else instead. And for years, this was considered an unreleased game. And then it turns out that in Brazil, this was released in very small quantities. And now, due to other companies which release these games after the fact, you can also get some Sega CD games this way. It is now commercially available for people who are gluttons for punishment. This is a game where you fly around and shoot stuff. It has kind of semi-full motion with kind of Corpse Killer-esque controls, just worse, but with a worse sense of humor. The game's very difficult to figure out, very counterintuitive. You tend to die for seemingly no reason. It's an F. It's got a lot of novelty value, and of all the 32X games we've discussed, it's the one which has the most air of mystery about it. It's also the most sought-after collector's item of all of these, and a lot of these are sought after, but it is total dog shit, and easily the worst of the FMV games, which is saying a lot, because all of these are kind of bad. Next up, we have the game Tempo. Tempo is, for lack of a better description, very Japanese. This is a platformer with active backgrounds. You collect musical notes, and I would have to say the game is fairly unique. It's a platformer which is unlike anything else I've played. That being said, I'm not actually a big platformer guy, and I wasn't really able to get into this, but I can kind of see how other people might be. If this game were upgraded and re-released on the Saturn or PlayStation, it might have been a hit. Clockwork Knight, after all, on Saturn was a relatively big hit, and I imagine that tempo would have been much the same. Instead, it was released on 32X and languished in obscurity. It also could have been downgraded a bit and put on the Genesis, or maybe even released on the Sega CD. At this time, there was a dearth of Sega CD games, but a much bigger install base than on 32X. I think tempo would have made a fine addition to any of those systems, but for me, this is a C. Again, partly it's due to my own bias. I'm not in the platformers. So, for me, not much to talk about. Next up, we have T-Mek. T-Mek is a deathmatch game you play with mechs. So that sounds pretty cool, and is kind of thematically similar to Metalhead, except there's no story. That being said, this game, while it is somewhat innovative since it has early 3D environments, is pretty repetitive and also blurry. Now, Metalhead is a little blurry too and a little blocky, but you can figure out what's going on and you can manage to draw distances. And this one, it just looks like pure shit. That being said, it is playable and it's fast. At the time, this would not have been that bad. Today, I can't justify spending time on this game. For me, T-Mek is a D. It's aged poorly. It would not have been a system seller at the time. It wasn't even that great as a tech demo, but it's a hell of a lot better and more interesting than a lot of the games we've talked about. And last, and not quite least, is Zaxon's Motherbase 2000. To the best of my knowledge, this was based on a game from the Atari 2600 era, or maybe it was an arcade game from the early 80s. Either way, this game at first looks pretty promising. The box art's cool, and I also bought this one as an adult at a pawn shop or a used game store or whatever it was, and I was pretty excited. I thought maybe this is a hidden gem, because I've loved Shadow Squadron for years, and that game kicks ass. This game's also about space, so it also must kick ass. No, it sucks ass. This game has a choppy frame rate, hit detection is very poor, and is borderline unplayable. It's probably better than Darkside, maybe. No, wait, it isn't. Darkside's definitely better than this. Well, that's a tough one. I'm not going to say Darkside is better than Zaxon. Zaxon is more of an isolinear view. Not isolinear, what's it called? It's like you view it kind of at an angle from overhead, but also your screen, you move kind of diagonally. So it's kind of neat at first, but then you realize the game's extremely limited. Hit detection sucks. It's an E. If you have to choose one of the crappy space shooters between this and Darkside, I'd go Darkside. But actually don't go with either of them. Maybe go with the Star Trek game. Maybe you'll have a better experience than I did. Star Wars Arcade is good. And Shadow Squadron is good. But basically here, what I'd recommend is only look at the games from C to A. And when it comes to the full motion games, actually Slam City, Night Trap, and Supreme Warrior in the D tier are pretty playable. At least in terms of getting a good laugh. But there's not really a must-play game on the system. And it hurts me to say that as a 32X fan, as someone who grew up with this system. But there's nothing here that you absolutely have to play. Okay, one closing hot take, because who the fuck gives a shit? 32X, for me, better system than Dreamcast. Not even joking. If I had to play one or the other, I would easily choose 32X. I don't like the Dreamcast. I got one a couple years ago. I've been completely frustrated and disappointed with it. It's very finicky. Most of the games kind of suck. It does not live up to the legend. 32X at least exceeds the legend, because the legend is just that it's total dog shit. And while it is kind of dog shit, it's not the worst pile of dog shit you've ever seen. is still better than Virtual Boy. That's all I got to say on this topic. Hopefully in the future I will be back with other pointless topics. Until then, who the fuck gives a shit?